Simon. My name's Grant Wilson. Good afternoon. I work for a company called Asset Risk Consultants. As it says, we're investment consultants. We exist to help people get the best out of the investment management industry. And we believe that wealth and financial assets should generally be a positive experience for our clients, but we're aware that for many, they have sleepless nights over the responsibilities involved. I'm aware some of the people in the room have significant financial assets as well as the other parts of their societies, and these financial assets and the income that's derived from them can be an important part of your world. So the comments I'm going to make are about bringing together some of the issues in income from financial assets. So, ARC has been around for 20 plus years. It is 65 professionals. You may have come across our indexes, particularly charity indexes, in which a number of societies are contributors, some 3,500 contributors in the charity space to our indexes, and they allow a comparator for your managers against the industry averages, both the mean and the top and bottom quartiles. We also produce a lot of report cards, 80,000 report cards, so we're quite good at publishing ourselves. Now, when we talk about investment policy statements on our investment consultancy, we're really talking about 5 things. We're talking about assessing suitability of a set of policies, writing up the investment policy statement, which controls the undertakings of your investment managers, including the strategic asset allocation, which should deliver the highest probability of meeting your objectives. We also talk about manager search and engagement. And the last component is the review to make sure that the objectives are being achieved. And if not, is there something sensible to be done about it? Now, the rest of the slides that we're going to look at contain quite a lot of narrative. And it's not there to compel you to read it just now while I'm talking. It's there so that if anybody downloads the PDF afterwards, they'll be able to work out what we were talking about without me in the room. But the 3 things I wanted to talk about here, firstly, starting with the end in mind. Sorting out the objectives clearly and documenting them is tremendously important. We have to make sure that we've got all the relevant stuff considered up front so that we get a buy-in. I put the next title as Acknowledging the Unknowns. There are plenty of things, not just the financial markets, where we don't really know what's going to happen next week or next year, but also for many of our societies, your visibility on revenues and your controls on the costs are not so great. So when setting a policy, we can build in an understanding of the uncertainty. And the last thing I put on the page was head and heart. Now, we tend to retreat into spreadsheets and numbers in the investment consultancy world, but we also recognize that we're engaging with human beings, and human beings have behavioral issues, certainly when it comes to money, and particularly at stress points when there's been a very bad stock market experience, people change their views, and that is a significant risk. And we can do something about that in testing with psychometric profiling to see how you're likely to react to the realities of the world that we're engaging with. Investment strategies and income. There are 3 ways that people generally approach income from investment assets. The first is referred to as natural income. That's collecting all the dividend payments and the coupons from bonds and the interest from deposits in a particular period, like a year, and distributing or using that and saying that's your income. The second is some form of averaging, a smooth distribution. For example, saying we will distribute 3% of the average assets over the last 5 years. And the third type of policy is referred to as a cash reserve system. And that's alluding to the idea of you have an agreement that, say, 3 years of expected spending is put in a cash account and transfers are made from your investment portfolio to that cash account on a regular basis unless there's been a significant setback in financial markets, at which point no more transfers are made until the portfolio recovers, and in the interim, the spending that you need to undertake is taken out of the cash account. Now, all three of these have their places, and depending on the realities of your organization, one of them might have more merit than another. I put a couple of extra bullet points down there saying you can, of course, add supplemental rules to any of these policies, but all the supplemental rules you can come up with will have consequences, which it behoves the people making the decision to understand. So, right down at the bottom, I've said possibly the most important thing in setting an investment income policy. The thing you want to avoid is being a forced seller of volatile assets in a distressed market. So the idea of setting a policy is to try and ameliorate the damage that might be done if that was the case. So, when you're setting a policy, we'd always suggest that the bullet points here are the kind of things you should have in your mind. What would be the maximum sustainable distribution that we could make? What would be the number of years before capital was exhausted? What would be the residual capital at particular dates? And finally, the sensitivity of your income to a variety of different variables. Now, the lovely colourful chart is one simple diagram showing the probability of successfully completing your objectives dependent on the withdrawal rate and the number of years for a particular investment policy. I put this up as an example, but these are the kind of sensitivity charts that we would encourage people to look at so that they understood the nature of their organisation and a considered policy in the light of things that could happen. Similarly, I think it's important to remember some things. On the left-hand side here, we have a little table which shows in a period of just over 70 years, 71 years, what would have happened to £100 in value. And the bit I'm going to call your attention to is, for gilts, the real return in capital, had you eaten all the income your gilt portfolio had produced, the real capital would have dropped from £100 to £2. So the red light says, inflation eats capital, and that's the message there. On the right-hand side, we have, if you haven't eaten the income that was coming in, but reinvested it, you'll see the kind of numbers that your £100 over the 71 years produced. So equities, the £100 was reinvested income, £5,140. The reinvesting of income is obviously a very important part of the way investment returns are made. And when you back up, you should think about, can you not eat all the seed corn so you can have a reinvestment going on all the time to give you these long-term benefits? Now, another issue that I think people often miss, shown in these charts. Let's start with the one on the left-hand side. What we've done there is say, let's take 10,000 portfolios and look at their returns through history. And the average return in this data set was a 5% return with a volatility of 16%, which meant sometimes we got a lower return, sometimes we got a higher return, and it's all shown in the bell curve. Now, when we're reviewing fund managers, we very often talk about percentage changes over periods of time, and we talk about a number like the average was 5%. But what many people forget is what's going on the right-hand side here. When we run 10,000 portfolios over 40 years, what we discover if we apply this return scenario is that some people are very lucky in the early days, and they're the only ones who will be able to access the very right-hand side of the right chart. The vast majority of people, their real wealth, and the stuff that you can spend and eat, is much less. It's much less than the average. The average is 12 in this model. And the reality is most people have an outcome that's nearer 3. And that needs to be understood, because very often people will talk about the percentage returns and they'll not realize that the wealth outcome for different participants in that 10,000 model set was substantially different. There are things that can be done about that. Some of them are listed here. In summary, I'm suggesting you consider and document and regularly review the objectives, that you confirm the investment policy addresses, including the income policy, addresses the most likely solution to the objectives that you've set, that you ensure the mandates given to the investment managers reflect both the policies and clearly what you're trying to do with the income. Finally, that it's monitored, that the chosen policy continues to be appropriate and is reviewed and revised as seems appropriate at the time. Now, I've got some general comments with bullet points there. Generally, large distributions in relation to the capital that you have suggest that you should have a less volatile strategy, something containing more bonds. Generally, a high dependence by your organization on its financial income would also suggest that you shouldn't have a very volatile income stream. Thirdly, that low confidence in your forecasting of your other revenues and your expenses would also suggest toning down the volatility of the income stream that you're trying to achieve. And finally, the longer an investment time horizon you have with comfort, the more likely you could endure volatility from higher return-seeking assets. Now, those are the generalities. And the final sentence was, the generalities are completely trumped by the specifics of your individual world. So I wouldn't rely too much on generalities. They could be turned into questions for your fund manager, but the key thing is that you consider the specifics of your organization and the demands that it faces from its membership and your purpose. So there's me beetling quickly through. I'd very happily take any questions you might have just now.
Yes, if you could take 1 or 2 questions for Grant now, and then we'll do more on the panel discussion later. Any questions? Anybody wondering how to squirrel away that 100 million you've got? I know.
Well, I've got off lately. No.
No.
Go on, Simon.
That's not how it works. One of the things that happens to me now and again as a consultant is that people say to me, I make, let's say, £100,000 a year out of my programme. I won't even say what it is. Let's say it's a publications programme. If I were to sell it, how much would I have to sell it for so that I would still have £100,000 a year to live on forever?
This depends on the assumptions.
It does depend on a lot of assumptions. But with average luck, in an average
and that
situation.
nice colourful thing, I think you want to look at sensitivities. It's very striking just now that interest rates are very low and they make an income stream very valuable. So you can get enormous capital sums if you think that's a perpetual source of revenue. But it's definitely something to be looked at in the context of making a whole pile of different assumptions so that you're not misled.
Yeah, and obviously the error bars spread out the further you go down the line. But it is interesting. I mean, I've definitely come across societies who've sought one-off huge donations so that they could fund a programme forever by living off the interest. So they weren't successful because obviously the person they were asking for the money from said, I'd rather give you a bit every year.
Yeah.
But so anyway, these things happen. Any other questions from the floor before we move on? No, well, you do get off lightly. Thank you very much. So next up is Helena.